All content contained in this video is created for informational purposes only. This video is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Seek the medical advice of a physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you heard in this video. Hey, I'm Honeysuckle, and welcome to my channel, Psychosis Experience. In this video, I want to talk about the DSM-5 definition for the brief psychotic disorder. I'm going to leave a link in the description so you can look at my PDF source for the DSM-5. And the page that I'll be going over is page 94 in the document, but it's page 132 in the PDF reader that I use. So I'm going to switch over to my screen and give you a summary. So I'm going to be talking about the brief psychotic disorder. There are a bunch of different disorders labeled in the DSM-5 for the schizophrenia spectrum, but I'm just going to cover the brief psychotic disorder because I think it applies to me the most. So moving on to the diagnostic criteria. Section A, presence of one or more of the symptoms. At least one of them must be one of the first three. So it must be at least delusion, hallucination, or disorganized speech, and it can also include number 4, but it is not required, just the first 3. Moving on to section B, the duration has to be at least 1 day, but less than 1 month. This is a pretty big factor in determining the different disorders on the schizophrenia spectrum. This is something noted differently in each disorder, and this one is particularly that 1 month range. And then on to section C, the disturbance is not better explained by something else. Gives a bunch of different criteria, but basically it can't be any other factor other than psychosis. Moving on to the specify if. This is more like a note from what I'm gathering. Specify if it's with marked stressors, if these symptoms occur in response to events that would be markedly stressful to almost anyone in similar circumstance in the culture. So if a person in their culture would be normally stressed out by a circumstance or situation, then this would be specified. Without marked stressors is pretty much the same thing as before, except if there's nothing that occurred. If the symptoms do not occur in response to events that would be stressful to almost anyone. And then moving on to the postpartum onset. Postpartum meaning during pregnancy or within 4 weeks of postpartum. And then going on to the next specify portion, specify if it's with catatonia. I discussed catatonia in the last video, so I'm not going to go into detail here. This is more like a note asking to specify it. Going on to the next specification, specify the current severity. Specify how severe the delusions, hallucinations, and other symptoms are. Each of these symptoms may be rated for its severity on a 5-point rating scale from 0 to 4, 0 being nothing, 4 being present and severe. Moving on to the next portion in this PDF, the diagnostic features. The essential features of disorder involves a sudden onset of at least one of the symptoms that was listed above in section A. Pretty much just repetition of section A. I'm not going to get into too much detail there. Some associated features supporting the diagnosis. Individuals with brief psychotic disorder typically experience emotional turmoil or overwhelming confusion. In my case, there was some emotional turmoil, particularly some sadness. When I would hear a certain song, I might feel really sad because it reminded me of certain experiences, but in my case, it wasn't always present. It may have rapid shifts from one intense effect to another. I can't remember a time where I had rapid changing emotions. It was more delusions and hallucinations in my case. And it also notes that there appears to be an increased risk of suicidal behavior, particularly during an acute episode. I did have suicidal thoughts, and I wanted to commit suicide at one point. So this kind of fits with the associated features. Moving on to the prevalence. So the prevalence in the United States may account for 9% of the cases of first onset psychosis. It also mentions that for people in developing countries, psychosis disturbances that meet criteria A and C but not B are more common in developing countries than in developing countries than in developed countries. So in a developing country, the duration, I'll go back to section B at the top. The duration of at least 1 day, but less than 1 month, might not be present in a developing country as opposed to a already developed country. And then moving onward to development and course. Brief psychotic disorder may appear in adolescence or early adulthood, with the average age being mid-30s. Moving on to the next section, risk and prognostic features. Temperamental, pre-existing personality disorders and traits may predispose the individual to the development of disorder. So we have something that's kind of similar in a trait of yours to a psychotic disorder, then that is a risk or prognostic feature. Moving on to culture-related diagnostic issues. It's important to distinguish symptoms of brief psychotic disorder from culturally sanctioned response patterns. They give an example of in religious ceremonies, someone might report hearing voices, but they generally do not persist and perceived as abnormal, and are not perceived as abnormal by most members of the community. So it's noting that if in the culture this is normal and expected, then it is not a factor in determining the brief psychotic disorder. Functional consequences of brief psychotic disorder. Basically, they just say the outcome is good in terms of social functioning and symptomology after the fact. Moving on to the differential diagnosis. I'm not really going to cover this in too much detail. It's basically just saying make sure it's not any other disorder or mental condition. I'm just going to briefly go over the entries here. Make sure it's not a other medical condition. It's not related to a substance. It's not related to a depressive and bipolar disorder. It's not related to any other psychotic disorder. It's not related to Miller-Green and facetious disorders, and it's not related to personality disorder. And that's where it stops. Starts on the schizophrenia disorder, but I'm not going to cover that again because I think brief psychotic disorder fits what I experienced, even though I was never diagnosed. I was diagnosed with psychosis NOS, and I couldn't find that in the DSM-5, so I'm just not going to cover that. So that's my video on the brief psychotic disorder. The next few videos I want to cover on explaining something on the hero's journey, and it's a hypothesis or general idea that I'm trying to work on. It's this idea that the particular kind of psychosis that I went through, which I attribute to mystical thinking, it has parallels between my experience and the hero's journey. So I want to try to explore that, and I'm trying to falsify this idea of psychosis being similar to the hero's journey. I've pinpointed at least one way to falsify this hypothesis, and I'm going to try to get into that detail in the next video. And I've also determined a criteria that needs to exist for this pattern to emerge, and if that can be also falsified, I want to look into that as well. But thank you for coming, and have a good one.